So Ma Seung lived between 1872 and 1951, and he was the son of a gentleman farmer. He did very well in school. His eldest brother was the schoolmaster, and he studied the Confucian Analects, the Mencius or the Mengzi, the classic of poetry or the odes, and he did very well. But as a youth, his family wasn't entirely convinced that becoming a scholar was the best route for him, so they tended toward thinking that he might become a migrant. And he was the second son, and that was pretty typical for second sons within families of his generation. It was his sister that provided the funds and the solution for Ma Seung to come to North America. And initially, it was planned that he would get off the boat in California to join his sister. But somehow, some way, he got off the boat in Victoria, British Columbia. It was 1891. And so Ma Seung began his early life in Canada in Victoria, British Columbia. In Victoria, British Columbia, he spent a lot of time with other young men from the Ma clan. In his diaries and autobiographies that he left for his family to find, he talked about his battles with various vices. He tried opium, he was tempted to visit brothels, and he was also very fond of going to the Chinese opera. But he eventually overcame these vices and found himself drawn more and more to the missions and to English classes that were provided there. In 1895, he decided that he wanted a change from this life in Victoria, and so he went to Cumberland, British Columbia. And it was in Cumberland that he got involved in the mission there and started to connect more with the Christian community and to see that his interest in the Confucian Analects and in the Mencius and in classical Chinese learning could have some kind of crossover into Christian understandings. And so while he was at the mission house in Cumberland, BC, he started to have conversations and debates in Chinese with Mr. Yeung, Reverend Yeung, who was the missionary there.
Picking up my courage, I waded into the argument, pointing my finger at Mr. Yeung's eyes and banging on the table with my other fist. I harangued him, accusing him of leaving the ranks of a cultured people and joining ignorant foreign tribes, and of being willing to be abject slaves of the foreigners, tempting our compatriots. This was done with a gnashing of teeth, protruding eyeballs, red cheeks, and a back bane. I confronted Mr. Yeung, and disregarding my own irreverent behavior, I felt that this is conduct fitting for a disciple of the sages.
So Reverend Yeung and Ma Seung developed a special relationship and friendship, and they would debate. And it was through that friendship and comparisons between Confucian and Christian understandings and beliefs and practices that Ma Seung eventually found himself converted to Christianity. And so in 1896, Ma Seung became one of the first Chinese Canadians who was baptized in Canada. And shortly after that, he was chosen by the Presbyterian Foreign Mission Board to return to China and to become educated at a Christian college in Canton, China, run by the Presbyterians. So even though Ma Seung had been well educated in China and quite erudite, he had to return to China to be re-educated by the Christians. Also, while he was in China studying at the Canton College, he met and married his future wife, Honglin Ma. And she was studying at an Anglican college. She had been educated as a midwife and a nurse. And so in 1900, there was the Boxer Rebellion. And unfortunately, Ma Seung and his wife had to return before his studies were completed. In 1900, Ma Seung and Ho Lin returned to Victoria, British Columbia. And although he had not yet been ordained as a minister within the Presbyterian Church, he now was the assistant missionary and pastor in charge of the Victoria Mission. And he would remain there from 1900 to 1907.
Dear Sir, I met you several years ago, and I often wished to write to you, only the dull hand disobeyed. I never learned how to write, but this time I will try to write and force my hand to do it because I have something I want to ask. I wrote to the Foreign Mission Committee at the end of 1902. In 1903, my salary was increased to $40, and my wife teaches Miss Gunn, for which she receives $5. There is only $29.80 to pay for washing, wood, light, clothes, food, and medicine for myself, my wife, and child. So I asked Mr. Yeung, write to Foreign Mission Committee to increase my salary again. He said Chinese food is cheap, and he was unwilling. I have been here almost 5 years, and I need help with the rent. I'm ashamed to write this letter, but I can't stop it because next month my family will be increased again. Then I need to meet more expenses. I wish you to know this. This is not to complain to you. It is my necessity to say, and I wish you to let me know what I should do. May God bless you and help you evermore. Yours truly, Ma Seung, 26 Farquhar Street, Victoria.
You see a consistent trend that the Foreign Missionary Board was unwilling to pay Ma Seung the salary they might have paid someone who wasn't Chinese or someone who wasn't able to speak the language and minister to the people. He received a lower wage. He also had difficulty getting his expenses reimbursed. When he asked to return to China on a furlough, just to have a break from his work and to return to his parents who were dying, his letters were ignored, responses were delayed, and you see a lot of frustration in the way in which Ma Seung tried repeatedly to write to the Foreign Mission Board and have them give him some response to his request for money or for a break to go to China and visit his ailing parents. In Cumberland, Ma Seung had quite a rich life. Eventually, by the time they left Cumberland in 1917, they had 4 children, and they had done very well. But it was time for a change, and Ma Seung requested to go to Winnipeg. And really, in Winnipeg, that's where our story begins. Because it's in Winnipeg where Ma Seung would remain from 1917 to 1935. And Ma Seung, while in Winnipeg, experienced a kind of life in Canada that he hadn't been able to experience in British Columbia. In Winnipeg, there was much less racism against Chinese, though there was strong racism against other groups, particularly Indigenous peoples. And in part, that's why the Chinese did so well in Manitoba, was because feelings were very negative toward other groups. By the late 1920s, it was very difficult to convert Chinese to Christianity because of Chinese nationalism and because of the need to support the nationalists in China. And so most Chinese, although they had initially been very sympathetic to Christian missionaries who relied on their contributions to support their missionary work, over time, once Chinese had learned English, they tended to no longer partake of missionary services. And so those donations that had kept the missionary services going started to dwindle. And Ma Seung was converting fewer and fewer individuals. It was very difficult for the Foreign Missionary Board to support what he was doing and to provide for the expenses. And the frustrations that had been present early on continued to grow. In 1935, Ma Seung requested to retire from the missionary board. He sent them a letter, and his wishes were granted, and he was able to return to China, where he retired. Ma Seung, even though he had dedicated his life to the Presbyterian Church and to the Chinese community, he felt really quite frustrated by the experiences that he had in dealing with the Foreign Presbyterian Board. He was very proud of his children. He loved his wife. He was an amazing father and husband to his wife, but somehow he never felt that he was given the kind of respect that he had earned while working for the Chinese Canadian community. And so he left Canada feeling somewhat bittersweet. His sons did amazingly well. They were all very accomplished, highly educated, but his sons went on and spent most of their lives trying to recreate an archive, trying to recover the memory of Ma Seung that had been omitted and forgotten by Presbyterians and members of the United Church. And though they didn't blame the United Church for the omission of Ma Seung in the archives, they really wanted to correct that. They wanted to get Ma Seung back into the history books and to recognize him for his enormous contribution and for the legacy that remains here in Winnipeg today. Ma Seung started a mission in 1917, and in 1947 there was a Chinese United Church, and from 1947 until the early 1970s, when that entire church was built, they would marry members of the Chinese community, and people would be buried by the ministers who came after Ma Seung. So that's really Ma Seung's legacy. He left a huge mark on the Chinese Canadian community. I saw in the story of Ma Seung something that I really wanted to portray in this work, which was not someone who was a merchant, not someone who was a laborer, but really a different story. Someone who was straddling the boundaries, who was sort of living in the shadows of both elite Chinese society and also elite Christian society. And although Ma Seung was so dedicated as a minister, he was really kind of ignored by both elite Chinese society and elite, quote unquote, white society, white Christian society. And that, I thought, was an important story to tell. After spending a decade of my life working on Chinese Canadian history on the prairies, I really wanted to get as deep as I could into the shadows. And although I couldn't talk about some things such as the horrible lives of adopted children, or I couldn't talk about Indigenous Chinese marriages, those things I just couldn't document. This was something I thought needed to be told, which was the story of these individuals who knew, on the one hand, that they were looked down upon by Christians. They were looked down upon by these very elite individuals of society. They still wanted to help. He had a strong belief in God, and yet he had a strong belief in Chinese culture and Confucianism. And I thought that ambiguity was really important to show here, that despite the racism, despite the financial obstacles, despite the fact that he came to Canada and he was all by himself, and institutionalized racism meant that his family couldn't join him, and so he was all by himself living in Chinatown. Despite those obstacles, he managed to have a remarkable life. He managed to help so many other people, and he wasn't connected to mainstream Chinese society, and he wasn't connected that strongly to Presbyterian Christian society. He really built himself up through education and through family and through his own faith in God.